I will talk about infrastructure and investment into infrastructure, why it is, because I think this is the white elephant in the room. There's significant investments in transportation infrastructure right now in Africa, and this is a kind of a new era. It just happened something like 10 to 15 years ago, and the reason why is because of China. A commodity boom, more money, and also more investment from China. So here you have large-scale investment projects, Tanzania Gabon Railway, $33 billion, Mombasa, Kampala, Kigali Railway, another $14 billion. Just last 2 weeks, 2 weeks ago, I saw there's another plan to invest in railroads again in the amount of $5.5 billion. So significant amounts. And the question is essentially, what is going to happen? Can we make some educated guess what is going to happen? Well, the first thing, there's lots of hope involved, obviously. But the issue is, when do we see the effects? Do we see them after 5 years? Typically, when we think about these long-run investments, there will be long-run consequences. Will this lead finally to something like manufacturing, industrialization? We have to wait for, say, 50 years to see this maybe. There's another issue why there might be actually not that many positive effects, because these railroad or road investment, they are directed. So we have lots of rent-seeking going on. I think it also depends on the context where these investments take place. We might think about poor countries with basic infrastructure and high trade costs. We should expect bigger effects of these investments. And middle-income countries that already have a more extended transportation network, we should probably expect lower impact. So how do we go about this? And it's a kind of a historical study, because we say, yes, there's a third transportation revolution going on, but there were two transportation revolutions before that, and maybe we can learn from that. Okay, so there was the first transportation revolution around 1900, the building of railroads. About 1/3 of colonial budgets, when you think about what the colonial state did, building infrastructure. Okay. Second transportation revolution, this was just after independence. It was an era of road investment. Colonial railroads, they fell into disrepair. African policymakers were not so interested in maintaining these railroads. And issues can be learned from these first two transportation revolutions to say something meaningful about the third one. Another issue is, and this is about the place where cities will be located. And this is a deeper issue about is geography driving where cities will develop. Okay? If that is the case, then we have just one spatial equilibrium. I think most of the audience here will say we have multiple spatial equilibria, and they come because of local increasing returns. Now, we have a kind of a nuanced take on that, because we are saying, yes, we have, or we had multiple spatial equilibria, but now we are essentially solidifying this urban network, and we are going to one very persistent spatial equilibrium. And it will be difficult for, in many African countries, to change this if policymakers want to do this. Okay, let me say something about the background and data. It's very narrative at that moment. What was the situation around 1900? Transportation costs were extremely high. There were few navigable waterways. So Africa was not blessed with a good geography. The tsetse fly meant that you could not use draft animals. There were no proper roads. And most of the goods were head-loaded on short distance. Slaves could be walked, but economic change was just limited to a few areas. So this is the picture of the cities around 1900. There are very few. So around 1900, Africa was the least urbanized region. And you see most of them, many of them are clustered along the coast. Some are inside. So this is the situation in 1900. The colonizers built railroads. 90% of these railroads were built before 1960, mostly for military domination. To take a claim on a territory, you had to control it effectively, and that meant at that time you need to build a railroad. Also for European mining, essentially this is having found mineral deposits and bringing these mineral resources to the port. Okay, so this is the main cause this, and then we also have reasons for cash crops. It was about 1/3 of the colonial budget went to railroad building. It cost also lives, so that's the picture of railroad construction. These are the railroads in 1960. You see actually that many of these lines, they are not linking the blue dots. Okay? So when the railroads were built, sometimes yes, from the port, but when these railroads were built, there were not cities along the railroad lines. Many villages along the railroad, they became railroad stations, and these villages turned into cities at independence. So this is the situation at independence. You see this here. Now blue circles dotted along the railroads. Okay? So we have more cities and also probably larger cities. After 1970s, many of these railroad lines declined because of a lack of maintenance, mismanagement, massive road investment away from the railroads. So railroad really lost a lot of market share. And so we can say that these railroad locations have lost their initial advantage. And the question is, would we expect these cities to persist, or would we expect these new road investments to come up with a new urban system? Okay, so this is a picture for 2000. You can't see well anymore, but this is why we get now to a more academic, rigorous analysis. So we have data of 194,000 grid cells for all of Africa, 10 kilometers to 10 kilometers. It's a very disaggregated scale for 39 African countries. We have data on transportation technologies, the pre-colonial, so access to the coast. That's what we saw. Many cities were dotted along the coast, navigable rivers. The colonial railroad lines, we also know where the paved and improved roads were built after independence. And we know where the cities are. Good. And now we are looking at the emergence of the urban equilibrium. The hypothesis is that rail connectivity has a causal impact of the number of urban inhabitants in the 1960s. And what we are doing is essentially using the urban population in a grid and asking, are they clustered along the railroad, using for dummies distance of the small grid to the railroad line. And then we have the population in 1900 and a few controls. We standardize urban population just to make them comparable, because we have urban population is increasing over time. So we want to stick and compare these urbanization between 1960 and 2010. Yeah, we dropped the largest, second largest, and capital cities to be on the conservative side because we think they could have been grown for political reasons. We use country fixed effects, so we look at variation within countries. These are the controls at the grid level: pre-colonial transportation, economic geography, physical geography. And we cluster, because we have 194,000 grid cells, we have to cluster the standard errors. Good. Having this very naive model, so you will say, yes, this is not a causal effect. Well, it might not be causal, because you can think that places were connected that were either more developed, that's the reason why you build a railroad, or you think that there's a higher potential. Okay? So this would suggest something like an upward bias. Nowadays, you can think about actually building a railroad to a poor area. And this could mean a downward bias. So how do we go about that? We have a battery of strategies, so we don't rely on only one. The reason why we do this is because it works for every strategy. Okay? So the first thing is that we do is to compare contiguous cells, assuming that they're the same. So whether you have the railroad here and you shift this 10 to 20 kilometers southwards or anywhere else, the unobservable characteristics of these cells, they should be very similar. We can include ethnic groups, fixed effects, district fixed effects. The idea is that ethnic groups have the same institutions within an ethnic group, or certain ethnic groups have a common economic activity like herding. So we just throw this into the regression. We can also use polynomials. Okay, so the idea is that all these unobservables, they are correlated across space, and we have a structural discontinuity just about where the railroad is. Then we can think about these different reasons why the railroads were built. Okay, so we have data on whether it was built for military domination or for mining. Mining railroads, they're typically really the shortest, to keep costs low, the shortest way from the mining to the coast. And so all these areas in between, they're essentially connected by random because there were mineral deposits found that had to go to the ports. So we can do this, look at the reason why these railroads were built. We can look at placebo railroads. So the idea that colonial government planned to build new railroads. They had the same potential like the ones actually built, but for some reason they were not built. Okay, so this is the picture. This is the military and mining railroads. Here we have the planned but not built railroads. In 1916, they had still grant schemes. Okay, how to build a really good network for Africa. After World War I, capital dried up. They went down a bit with the network, but we use both essentially planned railroad networks. So these gray areas, these are railroads that were planned but were never materialized. And we're essentially comparing those that were built with those that were not built but planned, assuming that they had the same economic potential. You can also use an instrumental variable strategy. Essentially, this is building from a social planner, taking the 1900 city network and thinking about how you can connect the cities at the lowest cost. And that's what we can use as an instrument. So we do this. So this is the only regression table that I show. And you see that there's a positive coefficient, okay, throughout, independent of what strategy we use. It's about 0.37. Very stable, very significant throughout. So this is about urban population. And here we have where it creates cities, independent of how big the city is. Now, this is essentially about local effects. And one threat or concern are general equilibrium effects. So we can have, say, economic activity, and because of the railroad, some cities decline. Economic activity is concentrated or moved towards the railroad. Okay? So some qualitative evidence suggests actually this is not the case. We have migration from rural areas to the cities. The other issue, and that's the nice thing about the railroads, there were almost no cities, right? If you don't have any urban cities to reallocate, then every new city must be a new city. Okay, there can't be any reallocation. But you can test this. So we do a few tests. The first thing is just to look at whether cities, we have negative effects in a 100 kilometer buffer zone around the cities, around the railroads. Sorry. You can also see it whether these cities of 1900 declined. Okay, that's what you expect. We have a new railroad, there's an old city that should decline, all the economic activities, urban residents should go to the new cities. We don't find this. We find positive effects. In fact, being a city in 1900 is as good as being connected later on. Okay? It has the same effect. We can also look at these country-specific railroad effects. So we have a bit of heterogeneity. Ghana results in a lot of cities along the railroad. Some other countries, like Somalia, that's probably what you would expect, but there's also Malawi, Namibia, Ivory Coast. The effects, the country-specific effects are lower. But we find a positive correlation with the change in urbanization rate. So if there's total reorganization, what you would expect is just a flat area. Okay. And that's what we don't find here. Good, this is about the emergence. Let me say a few words about the persistence. So railroads fell out of use in the 1970s, massive road investments, and now I would say most of the hinterland locations in many countries, they are now connected by a road. So these locations lost their relative advantage. And would we expect these locations to be persistently with a higher urban population? So we just do a regression, replacing the 1960 urban population with the 2010 urban population. What we find is that the effect on 1960 or 2010 is exactly the same in 1960. Okay, so the effects, the short-term effect of the railroad is exactly the same like the long-run effect. You can also look at the Yeah, some other outcome measures. I don't show you this, but these old railroad locations, they're typically better not only in urban population, in education, in roads, in night lights, and so on. Okay, so they are more developed today. But what we can do is to look at when the system became persistent. And what we do is essentially here to look at the population, regress this on the left population, so it's an autoregressive regression, and using the railroads as also a predictor. Okay? And the idea is essentially, when does this kappa become non-significant? Okay? So if we find here a delta of equal to 1, this essentially means that the urban population is just the same like the period before. Okay? We have extreme stability. If we have here a still significant effect of railroads, this means we have convergence. These railroad cities, they are still attracting more and more people that become all urban. Okay? So this is the picture. From 1900 to 1960, we have a huge railroad effect. But afterwards, essentially, this is when the urban system is set, it is solidified. And after that, we still have a positive coefficient, but it doesn't matter anymore. So the reading of this graph is essentially, between 1900 and 1960, the railroad created cities. So here we have a very low coefficient. Now these cities are created, but after that, the railroads don't play a significant effect anymore. Okay. So the persistent comes because these railroads created cities very early on. Now we can think about more about channels. One issue that we are interested in, and that is also why we should worry about local increasing returns, is because this can be due to market failure. Now, when you think about these increasing returns, we say that historical shocks play a big role. So you have a historical shock, and that puts you on a completely different path. Now, where do these increasing returns come from? Now, one issue is about sunk investments. Once you have the city, you don't want to rebuild it somewhere else. Okay? You don't want to move the city. But the other issue is there might be a coordination problem. So actually, the big advantage of having a city or having a railroad is to decide where a city should be built. There are factors that should be located, co-located. They locate at some place. It doesn't matter where it is. But once they need to decide where at the plane of all possible locations. Now, we can't do this for Africa, but we can do this for to other countries, Ghana and Kenya. So what we essentially do is look at the investments that were done in the 1960s. For example, railroads were better endowed in colonial schools, so schools might be sunk investments. That's the reason why they attract more people. Missions, hospitals, roads at independence. So when we do this, these factors only contribute to about 25% of this urbanization effect. And the remaining part is essentially what we then attribute to the coordination problem. So railroad cities persisted because the early emergence solved this coordination failure about where to create these cities for the colonial time and also then for every subsequent period. Now, one implication of this is that there are marginal decreasing returns for every new investment. Okay? If coordination is the main driver, you have the first city, you solve the coordination here, so problem is solved. A new investment should have less of an effect. Okay, so we can test this. We know we have here these three waves, so this is before World War I, of railroad building, and we can see whether these railroads have a larger effect on urbanization and on cities than this wave and this one, and also the roads. And that's exactly what we find. So we don't make a big point about roads, because we cannot really sort out endogeneity for roads, but the effect of these waves becomes smaller the later the building time. So what do we do with this? This is essentially an idea about what is the impact of transportation infrastructure on economic change in poor countries. And I think how we should think about this is that there are strong effects at the beginning, so for the first transportation revolution. But then on, for the second transportation revolution, there is a lower effect. And the reason why might be that now the urban system is already set, so building new roads doesn't change the system anymore. By the way, it is creating more cities. So we have exactly this kind of observation that we have these old big cities. More cities are created along the roads, but they are not growing big. Okay. So this could suggest, yes, multiple spatial equilibria. If this is mostly due to a coordination problem, it means that we have decreasing marginal returns to infrastructure investments. And then obviously one issue is at what places in Africa you have still coordination failure. Okay, so for example, southern Sudan, where we don't have many cities yet, here infrastructure investment could have a very large effect. While in other kind of African middle-income countries, we would expect a much, much lower effect of these investments. Okay, I finished here.
Okay, thank you.